I understand I gave them a panic attack right now because I thought there was a 10-minute break, so I went to go chillax out there. And, you know, because this is my siesta time, by the way. No, just kidding. So, and I hope it's not your siesta time. Don't fall asleep on my watch. And I'm like, oh, I want to know how it feels to be here at the end of the day. So I came here with the Neuhaus Education Center staff. At 6:15, we met at the Neuhaus Education Center, and we Ubered over here. So let's give an applause to the Neuhaus people for putting this on. Woo! That's awesome. So as I was thinking from your beautiful, oh my God, so inspiring, your work and everybody's work and art's work and the work of Neuhaus, you know, somebody asked me, well, Elsa, when are you going to frickin' retire? And I said, well, now I got more goals. And so, you know, just as you were talking, you gave me so much more motivation. We've been in talks with the American Speech and Hearing Association because we have these things called subspecialties. And what I'd like to see is a subspecialty because, you know, yes, we're prepared as speech and language pathologists, but when you become a certified academic language therapist, you really do learn so much more about that science of reading and teaching reading. But on top of that, I heard somebody ask out there, another goal I have, this is when I can retire, is to have the bilingual, not only certified speech language pathologist, but that speech pathologist that's also trained in the teaching of reading. And as we look at this, what about the bilingual certified academic language therapist, right? And what about how we should be looking at these children for the identification, kind of the questions that you're asking, and not only for the identification, but what about the treatment? And we shouldn't be treating them in the same way that we treat a monolingual, hello, and there's so much knowledge that goes into that. And yes, you know, we have programs, yes, you know, but what matters and what Neuhaus is about is preparing that professional and making sure that that professional can go on to really make these important decisions about the treatment of that individual child in your classroom or in your therapy room. And so when we look at the English learner, we see, okay, we've got lots of things going on, right? Developing language, developing literacy in one language, in two languages, issues of poverty that we've heard about, and you know, these risk factors, right? And so there's still much work to be done. And when I get those things accomplished, check off, I can retire, because then we have the sustainability. But we need people like the Neuhaus Education Center and like the work that they do, the high quality work that they do to make this happen. And just the thought of all of you here means that you are dedicated to making this happen. So as we talk, I know that my discussion today is about making connections, right? And so we look at, you know, all the work that we have to be done. There's 50 million children in our school systems, and 35 million are in preschool through 8th grade, and 15 million are in high school, right? And so as we look at that, there's 50 million children, right? And we see that we're getting close, and we will be, us English learners, at 10% of the population in our public school systems, right? But when we look, I remember talking to the state demographers, and they would used to say, oh, in Texas, by 2030, we're gonna look like Brownsville, or McAllen, or El Paso, right, or Del Rio. And I was like, is that a bad thing? And they were like, well, it's gonna look really different. High number of English learners, but are they going to be English learners educated and prepared for a workforce, the Texas workforce, right? And so that was the issue. Can we, in fact, dedicate our time to educating all children, right? And can we dedicate ourselves to the English learners? Schools in 2026 will have, will increase by another, 1.7 million, and we'll have more than 5 million English learners in our public schools. And when we look at that, we see that those 5 million will represent already more than 400 different home languages. In the United States, more than 70% of those English learners speak Spanish, all right? Here in Texas, it's about 91%, all right? So here in Texas, right, we have 5,431,910 students, and we have 1 million, right, 66,640. Between Texas and California, we have the majority of English learners, more than the majority across this whole United States. Of course, we got to include New York and Florida and Colorado. And as we look at that, 20% of our students in Texas are English learners, 20%. And 60% of all students are economically disadvantaged. This is what's reported. And Houston educates 22% of all students in Texas. So, you know, this is important work. So as we look at this, you all know about the National Literacy Panel Report. That's why we got those 5 areas of focus. How many of you know about the National Literacy Panel Report for Language Minority Children? How many know this report? Raise your hand. Look around the room. Now you do, right? We have this need to know, because how many of you work with English learners? Raise your hand. Okay. Right? So there is so much to learn about English learners and so much to learn about what these students need and what are those special considerations as we work for them to gain their language and literacy skills, right? And as we look at this, this is the National Literacy Panel Report for Language Minority Children and Youth, right? And it came right around the same time of the National Literacy Panel Report. So it's been out there, 20 years, right? And the focus there was, but what about these children that are learning English as their second language? And what are the things that we need to be doing? Yes, those 5 components of literacy are important for them, but what are the adjustments that are needed, these special considerations as we work on the treatment, right? And then we have, so I'm giving you like big, huge reports of putting together all the research, and then we get these reports out, right? So here's another one, Promoting the Educational Success of Children and Youth Learning English, the Promising Futures by the National Academy of Sciences, right? And it's saying, yeah, we need to do these 5 components of literacy that from this National Literacy Panel Report of Language Minority Children and Youth, but we need to be working all the while on their language skills, right? On their academic language skills as they are working on literacy. And we need to make sure that we're providing all these visual supports and verbal supports at the level of their proficiency. And as we look at that, this is the beauty, capitalizing upon the home language. And what I'm here to tell you is you do not have to speak the home language to capitalize upon those connections that we can make across languages. We have to do a little investigating, right? And here in Texas, 91% of them speak Spanish. Second most common is Vietnamese, right? And I've even found cognates and connections with Vietnamese and English. And as we look at this, we know that they have home language assets. We know that they have their cultural assets, and they have this knowledge. And it is not, how do we tell you? It is not a deficit model. So when I was a little girl in school, we were paddled. You heard Art talk about like the belt, but they had wooden paddles at our school, and we were spanked for speaking home language. Even on the playground, you could not do that, right? And I think about that, and I think about how, you just like really want to shut down and not participate because you're afraid if you speak your native language, you're going to get in trouble. But today, we're getting closer to the point of where we celebrate having a second language or a third language, and we're way behind other countries, right, that come out of school speaking 3 and 4 and 5 languages. And as we look at this, we think about, you know, what are those supports and what can we do to make these connections across languages? So I want to give you a term to use. This is the work of Neuhaus. Neuhaus teaches you how to implement, with fidelity and precision, structured literacy. Turn and tell your neighbor that term. Structured literacy. Say it again. That's what we do. That's what Neuhaus Education Center does. This is the instruction that makes the connection between all those language components that you just heard about and the components of literacy. Okay. Do I need to speak louder? Just hold it. Testing, there it is. Ooh. All right, so as we look at this structure of language, what we see is that we're working on that language. I want everyone to touch their left temporal parietal lobe over here. That's the language center. That's also the reading center. I don't care about this side. My husband's the accounting. How much do we have in the count? I don't know. But I tell him más o menos this much. He goes, you know how those guys are? They want to be to the penny. They don't want to have you mess up. But what I'm telling you is I hope nothing happens to that part of your brain. But we're going to be working, what structured literacy is really teaching all those components of language, the phonology, the morphology, those meaningful word parts, the semantics, the meaning, while also working on the form, the syntax, right, and the, if we added orthography, the written form, spelling. And it's this spoken and written discourse for deep reading and effective communication, as well as other aspects of cognition related to literacy. But the ultimate goal of structured literacy are for deep levels of comprehension and expression and lifelong reading and writing habits, right? And as we look at this, this instruction enhances reading and academic achievement of all students, but especially those students who are not meeting their grade level standards and who are at risk for these reading disorders. And as we look at this, and when we do our intervention work and our research, we're always incorporating language with literacy. And how can we go from the listening and speaking and the reading and writing and not work in silos, as you're mentioning, being very comprehensive in our approach, and getting a lot done in a little bit of time by using some very important frameworks. And as you saw earlier, you know, that phonology, how does that relate to literacy? Well, all right, you mentioned that phonological awareness and eventually that decoding and spelling, and the morphology. Oh my God, morphology is so fantastic. This is how we develop our vocabulary, especially as English learners. Phonics, it helps our phonics, our fluency, our spelling, our vocabulary. Semantics, it's all about meaning and eventually getting us to that reading comprehension. And syntax, don't forget syntax, because syntax can help your reading fluency, your reading comprehension, and your writing. And as we look at pragmatics, it's all about use. But under pragmatics also follows, you know, am I in the social registers of language or the academic, right? This is how I speak at home. This is how I speak at school. And in here, too, are those idioms and those phrases that, oftentimes people use these phrases and I'm like, okay, what does that mean? I've never experienced that. Can you explain that idiom? So in the work that we do, we make sure you'll see that top line all the while we're working on vocabulary, concept knowledge, and oral language. We start with phonemic awareness, move into that reading and spelling, and then getting into the fluency. But notice vocabulary, concept knowledge, and comprehension all throughout. And it's almost like all kids need that, but especially English learners. And as we look at the well-designed interventions, we know that we want to target where these students, where are they in this process of reading? And can we be using some cross-linguistic features of the language and use that as a resource when learning second language literacy, right? And then it's I do, we do, you do. Say it. I do, we do, you do. And so it's model, lead, and test, right? And so we do that in everything to give them a lot of opportunity for practice, but also opportunity for feedback. And these errors are minimized through direct modeling. We're always, every day, we are the diagnostician. We are the diagnostician every day when we work with our students. And as they're responding to our instruction, we are becoming prescriptive in our teaching because we're seeing what are they getting, what aren't they getting, and what adjustments do I need to make, right? And then we gradually withdraw that support as the students master the material, all right? So you all, how many of you have had the opportunity to be trained at the Neuhaus Education Center? Raise your hands. All right, so I'm going to test you for your knowledge. Here's your exam. So at the Neuhaus Education Center, you learn about how children develop literacy. Very famous Dr. Jean Charles stages that when these children are very young, right, they're at these beginning stages of learning the letters and sounds and then getting very accurate in decoding and more in fluency. But what happens to our English learners is oftentimes when they're really focusing now on English literacy, I've heard bilingual teachers tell me, the children, you only learn to read once. And I'm like, well, if you learn how to read in your native language, fantastic. That tells us about how you'll do in your second language. But you still have to learn all the foundational skills of the English language, the structure of the English language to apply it to literacy. So you cannot just assume that I'm going to be able to read in English because I can read in my native language. Even if that language is alphabetic and very tied to the English language like the Spanish language is, you still have to teach me the structure of that language. And so what we find in our research studies is when we go in there and we're working with English learners, we find that they're working at Jean Charles stages of reading to learn in all the content areas, but they're missing the foundational skills of reading, and they haven't learned that structure of the English language. So they're at read to learn, right? Read for learning. They're not at read for learning. That's what the classroom teacher's doing. They're still at that decoding, getting that automaticity, getting that accuracy going. And so, and then the teacher's like, well, I don't have materials to work on that, right? And so what you need is the knowledgeable teacher, and we have to go back because we're never going to get to these higher levels of Dr. Charles' stages of reading development, all right? But now I heard a question there about language, and I want to tell you about, first of all, in your preschool guidelines here in the state of Texas, right? How many of you know that there's preschool guidelines in the state of Texas? All right. So those preschool guidelines were written with something very much in mind to let us know, are these children at the point of their language and their literacy and their knowledge that they're supposed to be coming out with? And we have where they're supposed to be at how many months. And in there also, I not only have the language milestones, I have those language milestones for second language learners in those preschool guidelines, and I have articulation. Like, these are the sounds they should have mastered. And don't let them leave preschool without these basic sounds. So already there, we have language, right, and speech in those preschool guidelines. And then also, what are they supposed to be doing for those early literacy? No exceptions, no excuses, right? This is what they're supposed to be doing to get great outcomes. And so as we look at that, if it's second language, and there we do have, well, if it's an English learner, if it's second language, then we know at the very beginning they're going to be kind of reluctant to speak, but then they'll start using their language, they'll start putting words together, they'll start speaking in simple sentences, and eventually they'll get to that ability to communicate and speak in more complex sentences. They're getting those conjunctions in place. But we say it takes 5 to 7 years to get to that academic language, that academic second language, right? And oftentimes, we have to consider the context. And I'm going to be very frank with you. We do research. We're in hundreds and hundreds of classrooms doing all these observations, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. But it's very hard to figure out what works and what doesn't work when we don't implement with fidelity and we don't stick with what we're doing. Do you hear me? So the United States government gave us millions of dollars to go and see, let's see the work that you do, and let's see you scale it up, and let's see, what language of instruction model works best. And let's see what happens to these kids for their language and literacy skills. And we were in 3 states with high numbers of English learners. And as we would go into all of these classrooms and school districts and schools, and we'd look at the language of the teacher, and they said they were dual language one way. They say they were dual language two way. They said they were immersion. They said they were bilingual transitional early exit. They said they were bilingual transitional late exit. Blah, blah, blah. And so we're there figuring it all out, saying, okay, let's see what we come out with. And in the end, we came out with ADM. Do you know what that means? Ay Dios mío, right? That's Spanish for, oh my God, what do we have here? And we wrote a report for the United States government, and they did not publish it because fear that we were going to lose the resources. Those resources will be pulled from us because we're not doing our job. And so, you mentioned earlier, Tracy, about dyslexia. What are we doing? We don't stick with something long enough. I heard Art talk about that. Stick with something long enough to see what does work. And when we say we're going to do something, we must do it with fidelity, and we're forgetting that piece. And so the next 30 years, we're spending on what's called implementation science. And that's where we'll spend our time. What exactly does it take to get at that implementation so that we can get the outcomes that people like us get in our studies, because it's very controlled. We have the people doing the work and we're making sure it's being done every day. But what happens when we let go of those controls, right? What are the least controls? So what we know is English learners can benefit from this explicit instruction that's very systematic, that looks at structured literacy. And our job is to help them make connections, right? And we already have capabilities in our native language that should be used for the second language. And there isn't any research that exists that will tell you otherwise. It just doesn't exist. We know that when these students have these capabilities, right, in listening and speaking, that helps their reading and writing, not in one language, but in 2, and we can make predictions about what will happen to them. So let's incorporate and make those connections by using familiar sounds when possible. So here are some sounds. Say these after me. Say the sound th. Say k. Say ch. Say d. Say f. G. L. M. N. v, x, y. All those sounds are in both English and Spanish. Those are my consonant sounds, right? And so when I teach English literacy, do I need to tell them, hi, this is the letter S, right? Or it's sock, right? They already know, if they already spent time in their native language literacy, they got all of this. We got to spend time on teaching them the new sounds and those syllable types, right? So that would be something to do to design your treatment. So let's talk about those unfamiliar sounds. And this is where we get into trouble because many, many teachers are also English learners. And I went into speech pathology because my father would say, get me that share. And I'm like, Daddy, it's chair, 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 right? And so I wanted my dad to say chair with a ch, right? And so what we see is incorporating those familiar and unfamiliar sounds and using what we call approximation, all right? And why they make the mistakes that they make, for us to understand, they're not crazy, they're actually using their language knowledge. So here's some new sounds. Say shh, all right? Now say, and actually we have a voiced and a voiceless TH. And I'm here to tell you that English learners that are Spanish speaking don't even know that they already know TH. Well, actually, if you live in Spain, we do know, ¿cómo estás? We all have a lisp, right? Like the royalty. But what I want to tell you is that we do have that sound, th, all right? Do you know what letter we use in our language for th? It's actually that letter D, because that letter D actually does have two sounds in the Spanish language, but no one knows that, except freaks like me. So the Spanish word for finger is dedo, dedo. And anytime that letter D in the Spanish language is between two vowels, it is your TH voice. So when they write the word father as F-A-D-E-R, I say, good for you. You are so smart. You are thinking in Spanish. But you know, we in English don't use the D like they do in Spanish. We use TH, all right? So that Spanish medial D between two vowels is English digraph TH voiced, all right? So that's a connection to be made. Say the sound and they'll tell you, oh, we don't have that in Spanish. Well, in the English language, we actually have words with NG, and we do have them in Spanish, but we divide between the N and the G. However, in English, you have the pattern of N before a sound like say the word sink, say the word bank. Now I'm going to say these words. Say banco, cinco. We have before k, it's right there. So we should be able to figure out NG because we actually have the sound in our native language. Now, I've got that sound z, right? Right? Susie wants to go to the zoo. No, not the Sioux, the zoo, right? And so we don't want to let children get away with that, nor do we want, and oftentimes as teachers, we have to make sure that we have the precision of the speech sounds because the children, right, we are their models. Then they'll, what they hear, right, they process, then they're going to read it that way, write it that way, spell it that way. So we have to make sure. And then problematic for English learners are those short vowels like say ah, eh, ah, right? We also want to use sound approximation to get towards that precision, right? And that's when they're making those kind of sound approximation errors, I say, good for you, right? We're getting close here. And so we want to get to that connection to this new sound of the English language. And so here's a sound approximation. For Spanish-speaking English learners, that letter J is problematic. Say in English, j, j, j. All right, that's a clip sound. We have to cut it short. But in the Spanish language and the English language, we have the sound for CH. Turn and tell your neighbor the sound for CH and clip it. Let me hear it clipped. Very good. Now, touch your voice box, say ch. I heard somebody not clipping over here. Say ch. All right, I'm really good at my ears over here. All right, now say it with a voice sound. J, j, j. Turn off your voice. Ch, ch, ch. Turn it on. J, j, j. Turn it off. Ch, ch. So there's your j, right? And so those are called the minimal pairs of sounds. And so we do this all the time in speech pathology, don't we? So this is a way to get them to precision, all right? We talked about that Spanish medial D and that voice TH, right? Now, say ooh, like in moon, all right, in boot. Now, my English learners will write boot as B-U-T, and you're like, why are they putting but for boot? But our U is your digraph O-O long, all right? And I say, good for you. The sound is ooh, but you're using your Spanish letter to represent that sound. The English is that digraph O-O, the two O's together that make that long sound. So when they make these kinds of errors, there's usually a connection to be made there. Now, we also know that we have that trilled R. Some of you probably can't do that. Let's have a little fun. Let me hear this side of the room go. All right, this sound of the room. Now everybody say. Oh, good. We're ready to go to Mexico and have some fun. All right. So what we want to say is in English, we don't have that trill, right? And so it's very difficult for us to untrill, right? So I'm going to go to the car, right? No, it's the car. Or I'm going to eat at Rudy's barbecue, right? Rudy's. All right, so that's going to take some work. But we do have the Spanish soft R, all right? And so there's a trilled R, and there's a very trilled R with the two R's. And then there's the soft R that isn't trilled at all. So I want you to say these words in English. Say ladder, say bottle, cattle, letter. All right. What did your tongue do in the middle of those double medial consonants there? Your tongue just went up and down. And in speech pathology, we call that a flap, right? When your tongue goes up and down, it's a flap. We have a flap sound in Spanish, and it's the letter R between two vowels. Say pera, cara, hora, letter, bottle, butter. Very good. So they're going to use, right? So when we look there, is the English T or D, right? We use R for your medial T or D, all right? So when they write the word butter, they might spell it B-U-R-E-R. And you're like, why did they put butter? But it's because that R is T or D for us, the medial T or D. So you say, good for you. Let's make a connection. That's the same sound, but we use T or D. All right? So what else would I do different with my English learners? Well, if they have Spanish phonological awareness skills, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let's say they can do everything. They can blend phonemes, right? They can segment phonemes. They can delete phonemes, right? The correlation is 0.92 across English and Spanish. If I had 1.0, that would be perfect correlation. But how about focusing on the new sounds? And here's what you would do different for that. I'm still going to work on phonological awareness, but I'm going to incorporate and focus on a targeted sound. Here's my challenge sound, j. So I might say something, say the word ham. Can you change the h to j? Jam, ooh, and I'm going to do a little bit of vocabulary there too. I love to put jam, have jam, right, on my toasted bread, right? Say the word bet. Change the b to j. The word is Have you ever flown on a jet? Notice I'm doing total physical response. I'm doing visuals. I'm using my techniques for English learners, right? And so we can go through, say the word pig, change the p to j, and we're going to jig that fishing line. And then, or it could be the actual jig, and then we're going to go for a jog. Say hog, change the h to j. Students stand up and jog in place. So I'm using total physical response. I'm using the visuals, right, to extend into that vocabulary. And I'm targeting a sound because I already know that they can do phonological awareness. I'm just targeting my new sound. All right. We also know that they can benefit from introducing concepts that completely transfer, partially transfer, or no transfer. And so what I want you to do different is I want you to give them credit for the letters and sounds that they already know, right? And then we move into teaching them those syllable types, right? So here that we already said the consonant sounds, but here in the middle right here, what you'll see are those, what I call the partial transfers. So we have these letters in our native language, but they just make different sounds. So H is silent, you know, but in English we have that breath, right? And so we talked about the R and the J and the S and the Z. So those are partial transfers. And then my new sounds are, you know, typically going with those consonant, the different syllable types, and then will tell me how I'm going to produce those vowels. So you're going to tell me about those short vowels, those long vowels, those digraphs, those diphthongs. So here's an example. Listen as I say these words with the same sound. What sound did you hear? Let me write them. But what are we going to do different? Do you recognize this letter in your language? Is this sound a sound that you know? Do you recognize this key word, right? So jam, jog, jet. And then look here, I use jaguar, which is a cognate. I use that as my key word to make a connection to their label, right? But it has a different sound. All right? And here are the 6 syllable types. How many of you, make me proud. How many of you know the 6 syllable types from Neuhaus Education Center? All right, for those of you that don't, you sign up, right, to go take one of their courses. All right. And then here I have my reading practice, and it's focused, right, on that J, but I want to add some language to that. And I want to add some phonology, some vocabulary, maybe some cognates, maybe some ways to say it. So jam has multiple meanings, right? And they won't know those multiple meanings, right? So I talked about the jam that was, right, on my toasted bread, but can you all pretend that you're going to jam to the music? Or here in Houston, you get in a traffic jam. They have world experience with that, do they not? And then here's jet. All of these simple words had multiple meanings, right? We can fly on the jet, right? You have it can be, and then we can get to the syntax. It's a noun, right? Or as soon as I'm done, you're going to jet out of here, right? You're going to leave quickly. And then we have the inkjet, which in that case we can see that as an adjective, right? And then we can look at the different emphasis, right? Teaching them like Jen went on a jet. Well, who is what we're emphasizing. Jen went on a jet. The action is what we're emphasizing. Jen went on a jet. Jen went on a jet. And so teaching them these nuances of the languages, the English learners don't typically pick up on that, and oftentimes that's answering our WH questions as well. And then fluency. Here's what's different about fluency for English learners. Your reading rate, right, and your reading prosody doesn't predict, right, that reading comprehension like it does in monolingual English speakers. So learn that. What it's mediated by, what the variable is that oral language proficiency, all right? So I not only have to work on that reading accuracy, that reading fluency, reading with expression and with ease, but I have to work on that oral language proficiency for that reading fluency to have a great influence upon my reading comprehension. Does that make sense? That's something really important. Can you turn and tell your neighbor what I just said? What's important in reading fluency for that prediction of reading comprehension amongst English learners? Okay. Very good. Now, as we're looking at this, they can learn that code, but we're going to need to spend more time on that phrasing, expression, vocabulary, and oral language to really make it have an impact to reading comprehension. And that's the ultimate goal of reading, to understand what you read. And here, what you see is we've been learning about the letter J and the letter Z, right? And one of the things we want to look at, too, is how we can do some of that phrasing. And I know you've learned about like these pencil swings, but we also need to read it with expression. And so we can do a little bit of work here with our students, I do, we do, you do, to add those extra features, because this is where we get lost. Because sometimes we don't know where your word begins and where it ends, and you speak so fastly I can hardly keep up, right? And so by looking at here on the print and really working on that phrasing and how we emphasize, that's going to be very important to an English learner. And I want to add here what I call 3PV, 3RQ, all right? And what I mean by 3PV, 3RQ are the 8 best evidence practices that we have today for reading comprehension, but I use the acronym 3PV, 3RQ to help remind myself of what I need to make sure to incorporate into my lesson as I have students read, all right? And so we'll be talking about that 3PV, 3RQ in just a bit. And so that's what I would do in that lesson. Anytime that we're reading connected text, we do 3PV, 3RQ. And so as we get here, here's the wonderful thing. And do you know when I first had a chance to work on morphemes? I was an undergraduate student at the University of Texas at Austin. And and I remember I took this course as an elective, and it was called Greek and Latin Roots for Medical Terminology, Professor Daly. Did anybody ever take, he's still there. And Professor Daly, first of all, Professor Daly had an accent, or like the way he spoke, I was having a hard time. And I said, Professor, are you from New York? And he goes, no, I'm from the Midwest, but my speech therapist was from New York. I was like, okay, we're not supposed to be teaching our students with our accent, right? And I go, oh, okay. And I was asking him if he could speak a little slower so that I could understand him better. But it was there that I learned all about where these words come from and these word parts for Greek and Latin roots for medical terminology. And then you take that next test, that GRE, to get into graduate school, and boom, where does your verbal score go? But now, and I've been saying this for decades, we can work with young children on their morphological knowledge. But with my English learners, I want this, meta-morphological awareness. And what that means is understanding that these word parts, these morphemes, exist across languages. And when you know these word parts and the meaning, and you've had experiences with words with these word parts, guess what? It all transfers. 60% of the English language comes from Latin, right? We've got another great percentage from Greek. So with those Latin and Greek, we're off to a great start for English, but we have all of those in the Spanish language. And people didn't believe me. Some of my researchers, I was a junior researcher at the time, and they were arguing with me about whether we could do this with young children. I was trying to encourage them to do it in 1st and 2nd grade. They're like, it's not developmentally appropriate. And, you know, right now I talk about my little Andrew, and I was saying, well, he's a 4-year-old. Well, now he's going into kindergarten, so he's 5 now. But he had come to the restaurant Cobbleheads, which has the best tortilla soup in Brownsville, and he comes in and he has on a visor, and he goes, look, I got a new visor. And I said, well, little Andrew, do you know why it's called visor? He's like, no, tell me why. And I said, because it has V-I-S, viz in it, and then it has O-R, that thing that helps you to see when it's sunny. And I go, and look, I wear glasses. What do the glasses help me with? They help you with your vision. And I go, and you went to go see your great-grandpa in the hospital. You were a visitor, the person who went to go see him. And then he says, oh, and Harry Potter has an invisible cloak. You cannot see him when he has the cloak. He is not seen. And I go, that's right. Little conversation. Visor, vision, visitor, visit, invisible, right? Preschool age. He's now in kinder. And I was saying, the Dr. Sines, who's the principal, says, I go into the room every day to see what little Andrew has to say. And I go, yeah, how about we get everybody to do that work? Because he's not any smarter than anybody else. He just has an amama that's going to, really promote this language, right? This wonderful language. And so we want that. And guess what? I got it into all your standards. And as we look at your K through 12 standards in English and Spanish, you'll see morphemes in there. And you'll see them at a very young age now. And you'll also see in vocabulary, this is my thumbprint, that you have to use the words. Everywhere it was like, oh, they're going to understand. But you've got to use. And we say 12 to 17 times to use the words to really show the mastery. So you've got to create those opportunities for use. And when you say, what does a speech pathologist do in that little room? And we should be working with everybody, but we already have in our mind, and we've already created that use, all right? So these are the best word learning strategies for English learners. Cognate awareness, knowing those words that are similar. The morphological awareness, right? And the ability to identify that these words exist across languages. So here's the word canoe in English and Catalan. So I do work in Barcelona, and they learn Catalan first. Canoa in Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. We look in French and in German, right? And here are these words. They look familiar to you, right? They look familiar because they look similar in spelling to English words, right? And here again, we're going to be adding the pictures, having our discussions, and we can do it by themes. That works very well for our English learners as we work on these cognates. And we have wonderful cognates in science and in social studies and mathematics. Fantastic, right? And so here, as I'm working, you've learned through Neuhaus how to work on teaching morphemes, but some of the things you might add are, do you know this in your native language? Can you tell me about it? Is it spelled the same? Does it sound the same? What are the words? What are the cognates that go with that? Can it be used as a noun or a verb? Or how do you use it? Can you use it in a sentence? What's similar between your native language and the second language, right? And then, and so here's just some examples of those, but when she was saying, Tracy was saying I did Esperanza. In Esperanza, we have 91 word parts that they learn in their Spanish language, and every single one of them translates to English to make hundreds of thousands of English words, right? But they won't know it unless you make those connections. That's your job, right? And so here's a sample lesson for my prefixes. And so here you see these words like bilingual, bicycle, bi-monthly, and I'd have pictures. You do something 2 times a year. What would that be? What is it in your language? Are they cognates? And then let's start our word wall and bring these words to life, and let's keep working on them and keep adding. And sometimes we have the entire school do this, where we have the tree and all the kids have the leaves, and at the end of the week there's all these words that made the tree with our word part. All right, and so this is the 3PV 3RQ. And so every time we have our English learners, we make sure that they start off with their purpose. We prepare their connection. We do their predictions. We do the vocabulary, and if that vocabulary has word parts or cognates, we do that. We read, retell, review, and then we question, answer, and we question, generate. And those all come from the National Literacy Panel Report, and I just made an acronym to remember them, right? So I'm out of time. And I just, want you to know that there's connections to be made for phonological awareness, for phonics, for vocabulary, for fluency, and for comprehension through the 3PV, 3RQ. All right, and so here's some practice guides. We have this one on teaching academic vocabulary and content knowledge to English learners in upper elementary and middle school, and you can read about our studies in that one. These are really easy to read, and they typically have 4 or 5 recommendations, and they tell you what we have strong evidence for and what we have just moderate evidence for. All right, and then this one's with RTI, and this one's with K through 3. So you can just even Google those practice guides. All right. And we have information in Spanish and English at the International Dyslexia Association on dyslexia. If you go to resources and you go to fact sheets, we have those in English and Spanish for our families. And at the Center for Applied Linguistics, we have information on our research in Washington, D.C. University of Houston here, we had the Center on Instruction for English Learners. We still have stuff up on that website. And then here's for the IES practice guides. And in Colorín Colorado, for those of you were asking about, somebody asked about the diagnosis. There's a webinar that I did for Colorín Colorado, and it's about an hour, and it will answer your question. So, in an hour, not really, but it'll give you some guidance. All right? So, thank you very much for being here for today, for not falling asleep, I don't think, and hopefully you got something out of it. Oh, what? Excuse me? Questions. Oh, questions, okay. I thought when you gave me a minute, I didn't have time for questions. All right, sorry that I rushed through that. I knew I had too much in there. Questions? Yes, ma'am. You mean the distinguishing between?
I asked, do you have a trick for distinguishing between I, E, and Y? Because
between
in Spanish
the long or short? Or
like if I just say write I, or if I say write E, it's usually with E. They always write an I or a Y.
Okay, yeah.
Because they don't know, and so.
Right, right.
Do you have a
so,
trick for that?
well, because our E is I, right? Yeah, so I'm going to say, okay, that was in Spanish, what is it in English? And then I might do kind of like pictures that go with it. And I thought you were going to talk about the short I, how problematic that is. Yeah, so I think, you know, and also like kind of color coding kind of helps them a little bit, and then showing them the different words and how, yes, in Spanish, what?
I say the curvy one or the down dot.
So, oh, so they're using the letter E for I, or I for E. Yeah, yeah. I think having pictures and color coding, and then I also kind of do total physical response for that as well. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Everybody knows what to do with English learners? Yes, ma'am. Say that again? Oh, right. So,
are bilingual programs more effective than immersion? Or?
So, what we know about the brain and being multilingual is we see great cognitive advantages, and actually we can see in the brain when you get to those advanced stages. And I was telling someone, I used to work in head trauma for many years, and so in our head trauma world, it was very well, you know, documented when you had those multiple languages as a resource, your recovery, how we got you out of coma and back to learning to, you know, talk and understand and read and write was much better. And our bilingual dyslexics actually respond better to the treatment than at a much quicker rate than the monolingual, and it's because of that cognitive flexibility, having to go back and forth. So we're using more of our brain. So it is advantageous to know more than one language.
That wasn't my question. My question is like actually when you're instructing. For instance, I took French for like 10 years, but I can't speak French. I learned German with the lowest grades I ever made in college. I can speak German because it was immersion. Like, how is that transferred over with the kids?
Yeah, so when we tried to do the studies to look at immersion, the differences between immersion, dual language, transitional bilingual education, we weren't able to come up with a determination because there wasn't consistency across all the places. There wasn't any fidelity. And so when you do work for the Institute for Education Sciences, you have to, we have to know exactly what's being done each day, and it was so not done with fidelity that we couldn't come up with any conclusions. But what we know, what I can tell you, is when you have an expert teacher, and when that teacher really works on scaffolding language, that the ability, to learn another language is possible, and to learn to read in 2 languages is possible. But you're right in the timing of it. So, so we always, when we come in and do interventions, we try to respect exactly what the school district is doing. So if they're doing immersion, we try to do that, but we do put in those extra supports from native language because they need it. And if they're doing dual language, we will do a bilingual intervention, or if they're doing, whatever they're doing, we try to match the language of instruction, but we have to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the child at their point of proficiency across the languages. And so that's what's very important, right? And so, that's why the work of Neuhaus is so important, because we want expert teachers. And, and if your class was just, sit and listen, you have to use and have practice to be able to truly master. And that's in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And probably your teacher in German maybe did a lot more practice in that area to help you develop German, or your ear was better for German. But there isn't anything that says immersion works better.
So it's just,
we don't have that documentation.
Because bilingual would actually have the connections that you encourage us to make.
Does bilingual education have the connections?
You were encouraging us to make connections between,
Yeah, so when you're teaching English, if possible, to make it more relevant to them, to see, is this something you have in your language, right? And how do you represent it? Is it the same or different? Anybody else? Yes? You all have really stuck it out. Where are the prizes that we were going to get? Are we getting prizes? We're still here. I want to see if any of us got a prize. Thank you all very much. Yes, ma'am. No? Do I get to pick the prizes?
I have one more question for
Yes.
you, Elsa, and that is, there was 20 years ago a major change that took place for students in Brownsville, and I know you were a catalyst for that change. What gave you the courage to step out, and what was the result?
So in 1996 and 1997, what we saw were too many children with disabilities and not enough children that had language and literacy. And so with a group of 5 of us, we got the university and the school district to really dedicate. It was called Brownsville Reads, and in 5 years our goal was everyone to read by 3rd grade, and that was in 1996, 97. And so we had a 5-year mission, and in those 5 years, with our partnership with Neuhaus Education Center, we were able to really do incredible work, and we had an 84% reduction in referrals to special education, not dyslexia, dysteachia, and then the work continued to where we won the Broad Award also and got $1 million. And then Neuhaus invited me to come and give a speech at one of their luncheons, and Mrs. Barbara Bush was in the audience. And when I went back to Brownsville, she called me on the telephone, and she says, "Girl, I want you to come back. I can't believe what you did, and I want that for Houston very much. Come and speak at my celebration of reading." And I said, "Okay, Miss Bush, but I need some money. They're going to raise $2 million. I go, can I ask for some money while I'm up there? Because I want to make sure we have, a certified dyslexia practitioner, therapist in every campus of our school, of every school in our city." And she said, "Yes, come on." And so I go, "Who are the other speakers?" And she goes, "George W. and H.W. and Secretary Baker and Laura Bush." And I'm like, "Oh." And she goes, "And everybody's mad at me because we already have the brochures, but you're my guest speaker, you're first." And I'm like, "Oh, that's even worse." So I just pretended like they were all naked. You'll be glad to know I didn't pretend you were naked out there. And so as I was up there giving my speech, and Mrs. Bush came up and she goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have a huge surprise for Dr. Cárdenas Hagan." And she goes, "Here's the money that she needs, no questions asked." and I about fainted. And with the help of Neuhaus Education Center and all the wonderful staff, Mary Lou Slania, I mean, all these people, we were able to train all the therapists, and they all passed with 100% their exam, and we have a therapist or a practitioner on every campus in our city. Thank you. And we're the #1 city of poverty for the United States for a population of over 100,000, and we are an A school district.